The Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. This is the podcast to raise awareness about threatened birds, endangered birds, critically endangered birds, the unknown tribes, and the warriors, the academic warriors, the conservation warriors, the field workers who are trying to do something to help and to get things done. Today, it's a real pleasure to have cyber met and to talk with Dr. Rob Davis from the Edith Cowan University in Perth. And funnily enough, the people from Perth seem to be very, very, very happy to talk to the Bird Emergency and our audience. How are you, Rob? Thanks for coming along.
Yeah, great, Grant. Thank you very much for having me along today. Yeah, I think there's probably a bit of the Perth factor that we're just delighted that anyone knows we exist on this side of the continent. So we're always happy to chat.
Well, you got some of the grooviest birds going around over there. But what we're going to talk about today is not the birds on the west coast of Australia and not the birds on any coast of Australia, not in the middle of Australia, not the north of Australia, not the south of Australia. We're talking about Pacific birds, and that's pretty much how I got in touch with you. That was the Pacific Birds handle on Twitter. You're always putting up fantastic photos of the birds on the Pacific. So let's take it away, Rob. Senior lecturer in biology at Edith Cowan University, but all-round bird nerd.
That's right, definitely.
Rob, let's start with the easy one, the Pacific Birds Twitter handle. Why did you start it? What's the point?
Yeah, great. Well, I guess we'd have to go back a long, long time ago into the distant past when I was very lucky as a child to grow up in Fiji. So I spent most of my formative years there before moving to Australia when I was about 10. So I guess it instilled a great love of the Pacific in me pretty much forever. And as the twists of fate would have it, I ended up being a biologist and being very interested in birds and bird watching and being lucky enough to be able to research them. And it quickly sort of became apparent how poorly studied the birds in the Pacific region were. And you've got a region which has the highest extinction rates on the planet for birds that are just ridiculously high compared to anywhere else on the planet. Yet we know so little about most of these birds. So I guess it was a bit of a combination of having this long love of the Pacific and always choosing to go on holiday there when I could, and then getting the opportunity in my first year as a researcher. I was lucky enough to be able to do some research in Papua New Guinea on one of the world's largest islands of New Britain in the Bismarcks to the east of PNG. So that sort of reaffirmed my love of tropical birds. And went on a holiday to Palau in Micronesia and travelled throughout the Federated States of Micronesia and ended up trying really hard to get back there and do some work on the birds, and was lucky enough to be able to secure some funding to do some research in Palau, which is what we're going to talk about today. So I guess all of those things combine to sort of say, hey, here's an amazing part of the world with almost every island has birds that are endemic. They're not found anywhere else, yet they're under really great threat. And yet we know virtually nothing about them. So even in our lifetimes, Grant, some of these birds have gone extinct, including on some Australian islands like Norfolk and Lord Howe. So, this is still happening. So to me, there was no greater imperative. And then I realised in social media and other outlets, there's very little publicity about this issue. So I thought, well, it's time to seize the day and do a long-held passion of trying to start a feed on Twitter to promote the birds of this hitherto poorly known and studied region.
And when we talk about the Pacific region, we can't ignore history. We can't ignore politics, and we have to recognise that countries like Australia and the US and France, to a lesser extent Britain, and even I think Germany and Belgium had some kind of a footprint on the islands in the Pacific. Palau, I think, was an unofficial American colony. I mean, I don't think it's ever been politically and legally referred to as such, but the Americans governed what happened in Palau for the greater part of the 20th century. So when it comes to preserving, protecting, generally shepherding the vegetation, the habitats, the birds, the critters, the creatures, all of these countries have really got a responsibility, don't they?
That's right, exactly. And Micronesia is a really interesting case in point in that during the war, Japan was occupying, I guess is the correct word, Palau. And after it was taken or liberated, as they like to say, by the Americans, it was more or less governed under America until I think it was fairly recently, don't quote me on it, I think it was as recently as the 90s or early 2000s, there was a decision on whether the countries would become independent or not. And at that point, the Federated States of Micronesia, which were also under American rule, decided to unify, and Palau decided to go it alone as a republic. And all of them to this day have a compact of free association with the United States. So it's certainly politically, as you say, that's still quite a significant influence on what happens. And likewise, on our doorstep, I mean, Fiji was formerly under British governance for many years until it became independent. And as you say, Germany had a strong role in the Bismarcks where I was in New Guinea. So we don't have to look far to see that. And of course, even to this day, politically, New Caledonia and French Polynesia are still part of or governed by France. So you're quite right that in a way the old superpowers, if you like, are still very much determining the fate as well, certainly financially, of many of these nations.
And the development and the exploitation, the industries that have exploited and continue to exploit the natural resources in the Pacific functions of colonialism. So my point, and what I really want to drive home to anyone who's listening, is that Britain's a long way away, Germany's a long way away, Australia is relatively a long way away, America is a long way away, but also shares a sort of ocean border with these places. But the devastation, the habitat loss, is a result of the wealth that has been generated in all of these countries. And morally, at least, and probably legally if the law was tested and used, we must devote resources and support the residents of these countries to look after what they have left. Here endeth the lesson.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And, we're talking many countries with extremely low GDPs that are entirely dependent on imports coming via ship or plane. And as you say, there's certainly not always the funding there. And it's an incredibly hard region to get any funding to do things. And to this day, most of the money for environmental programs is coming from the UNDP, the World Bank, and fairly large conservation initiatives in lieu of not being able to domestically fund the sort of programs that are needed. So definitely implore everyone out there to consider the Pacific, particularly if you might want to make a donation in environmental causes.
Now, Rob, you have the great pleasure, I think, of introducing the reason why we're devoting a whole episode to a pretty unusual bird, but that people in Northern Australia will be familiar with the genus particularly, and correct me if I'm wrong, they'll be familiar with the species but not the subspecies.
That's right, Grant. So the fascinating group of birds that we're talking about today in fact should be known to pretty much all Australians. The greater group of birds are called the megapodes, and they include some well-known Australian denizens. Even those living in the semi-arid regions of Australia will know the malleefowl. That's probably arguably among the world's best known and best studied of the megapodes. And then if you're lucky enough to live, I guess, anywhere from sort of Sydney northwards, you might encounter the brush turkey. And when you get to northern Australia, you'll come across the orange-footed scrub fowl. And all of these species are megapodes. So megapodes are basically mound nesting birds, and they have this strange quirk, which is that they don't incubate their own eggs. They've given up on that idea. They just use the environment. And that might be using in decaying vegetation, or in some bizarre cases, using volcanic or geothermal activity or passive solar radiation. So there's a whole diversity of strategies. And there are 22 recognised species in this group of megapodes. And their main distribution is, in fact, in our region. It's in Australasia and the central Indo-Pacific region. And they range as species from as far west as the Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean, right across to Tonga in the Pacific. So we're talking a very broad geographic range for a very unusual group of birds.
And their breeding habit of incubating via a mound generally gives them a shared relationship or a characteristic with turtles.
That's right, indeed. So both species that certainly are similar threats as well, because
that's where I was going, because you sent me a couple of things to read, a couple of papers, and of course I'm like everyone else, time poor. I scanned the summaries and the introductions, and I made a little list here, Rob. Let's start with the threats. And I'd written down the old favourites: invasive species, habitat loss, introduced predators, and sort of human intervention and threats related to human activity. But the number one in that particular paper that you sent me was climate change, and I was thinking, well, it's obvious when you think about it, because the hatching, the success of maintaining the population is dependent on temperature.
That's right, exactly right, and rainfall.
So I guess drawing it out maybe longer than it needs to be at this point is that climate change is not something that is just about whether it's going to be hotter. It's so entwined in the lives of so many species, and we have to break out of thinking about, how's it going to affect me?
That's right. So,
crocodiles, alligators, lizards, the insects in burrows, it determining the sex of turtles. I mean, just let's all just think about it a bit broader than we have been. It's a critical problem, and the poor old megapodes. There's not one species that's going to be able to shake off the effects of climate change, and we have to intervene.
Yeah. That's right. This is the single biggest problem of our time, and this is just one group of birds that we've chosen to look at. So, arguably maybe among the greater affected. And yeah, as you say, Grant, I mean, our review paper looked at all the species bar the malleefowl, because it's not really the tropical sort of species like the other scrub fowl. And all of them had a big impact. And as you say quite rightly, I mean, we're talking changes to seasons. When is the timing of the rainfall? How long is the dry period? How many hot periods are there? And of course, species that are using vegetation for their decomposition to create the heat. I mean, if there's not enough rain and it's dry, that won't work. If temperatures are changing, that's going to create problems. And then on top of that, we've got species like the Palau Megapode that we'll be talking about in some more detail, and they nest very close to the edge of the ocean, and they're already suffering the impacts of changed patterns of cyclones and hurricanes, which are causing mounds to be washed away. And then some species in Indonesia are heavily harvested by humans, so you've already got those pressures, and invasive species like rats. They had enough going on, and now we've got climate change impacts on top of that.
How does a megapode measure the temperature in the mound? How do they know if they need to? And we just generally talk about how they regulate the temperature. They put more leaf litter on the heap, or they open it up and scratch it away to let heat either escape or be generated by the initial stages of composting.
Yeah, that's right. And as far as we know, they actually use their bill as a sort of sensitive thermometer, and they're able to gauge the heat of the mound. And as you quite rightly say, remove or add vegetation accordingly, which is quite remarkable. And there's still a big knowledge gap on exactly, the feedback, how they can do that. Or maybe it's a bit more coarse, a bit like us putting our finger in the bath to see if it's too hot. They just got, some reasonable idea. So, yeah, they're really pretty good at that.
And depending what the method is, the ability for them to adapt to climate change will be affected, because if it's like a hard, like if it's just their bill and there's sort of a level that they must reach, or like if there's because we're doing audio, it's hard to sort of say, but if there's like a red line that once it's too hot, they'll destroy the mound, or by scraping it all away. If the temperature surrounding them means that the mound can't be maintained below that red line, they're done. But if it's more an intuitive thing, and for that the second way that they make a judgment, maybe there's a bit of hope that they can adapt their habits to hotter temperatures. But they can't do anything if the only locations that they can build mounds is next to or adjacent to the sea, and the sea is not only rising but also encroaching further inland, but also the soil profiles of small islands means that maybe the water table has also moved, so there's an effect on the mound that we can't see anyway because of the water table.
Yeah, that's quite right, Grant, I think. And we did actually look in our review paper at their adaptive capacity. And as you say, some species we said had a pretty high capacity probably to adapt, and some not so much. And again, those were ones, like you say, that they're very limited already in habitat. They have a very restricted range. They're already rare. They might already be suffering things like harvesting. So there's not necessarily, the ability for them just to switch what they do. And again, don't underestimate the impacts of the change in seasons. If something that could once breed for 9 months now has its window narrowed to, say, 3 months, you could be talking, 70% less reproductive output, which is rapidly going to change populations for the worse as well. And of course, the ability for them to find food is going to be reduced. Oh, look, it's hard to not be really pessimistic, but let's hope that somehow there's some urgent and real meaningful action taken. Yeah.
Rob, and it's good. I get you on because you're an actual scientist. You were able to say in a small paragraph what I waffled for about 300 words to get out there. So, okay, the Palau, are we calling it a jungle fowl or a scrub fowl?
Scrub fowl is the currently promoted BirdLife international name, so we stick with that, and that recognises a distinct subgroup of megapodes. So they're generally the ones that use mounds with vegetation, and more like the orange-footed scrub fowl that people around Darwin will be really familiar with.
And northern Queensland too, I think.
Yep.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah.
Let's start, Rob, with the research that has been done. Tell us about the projects that you've been involved with, and if there are any others that are currently underway.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. So I can take you on a journey to an amazing place to start with that is a bit of a dream of mine, to work in the Republic of Palau. I remember many years ago seeing a documentary about these incredible islands, and I encourage you to Google image Palau and Rock Islands, and you will be absolutely blown away. There is probably nowhere more beautiful on the planet. It's world famous for these beautiful limestone islands scattered across these shallow coral reefs. And it's also world famous for its jellyfish lake, which is a landlocked lake, but with a marine connection that has stingless jellyfish that have evolved in this lake and you can swim with. So it was always my dream to go there. So I went there in 2008, just on a holiday. And when I was there, I came across some of the ornithologists on the island and came across this strange beast. I was very excited to see the Palau scrub fowl for the first time. But I was rather dismayed when talking to the local researchers that there'd recently been a hurricane, and they were telling me that up to 20% of the nest mounds were actually washed over by these, they call them typhoons, in the northern part of the Pacific. And the mounds were there, they were lost to this. And I thought, wow, this isn't good. And it seemed like no one had really studied this species. So I went back to ECU. I just started my job there then, and I was determined to do something on this species. And as fate would have it, a few years later, I met someone on more travels in the Marianas Islands, actually, who was the ornithologist there, Paul Radley, and bumped into him while I was birdwatching. And long story short, he ended up moving to Australia to do a PhD. And there was no one better to work in this region. So we managed to do a PhD program for him on the Palau scrub fowl and trying to understand the impacts of these typhoon events, what the likely impacts of climate change were, impacts of rats, the whole ecology of the species. And of course, none of this work in the Pacific is ever possible. It has to be completely in collaboration with the local people there. So we had great support from the Palau Conservation Society, that's the BirdLife partner in Palau, and the Palau National Museum, and a guy there called Dr. Alan Olson, who sadly passed away about 2 years ago. He was instrumental in allowing us to do some of this work. So that was the sort of how we arrived to get there. So after a very, very long battle trying to secure any funding, we did this project on a shoestring. It's very, very hard to get any money to work in the Pacific, and even harder, strangely enough, to get money just to work on the ecology of a threatened species. It's not considered sexy science. So people can get vast sums of money to look at evolutionary questions. But when you just want to find out what's going on with a rare species and why it's rare, virtually no one wants to give you money. So that was a real challenge, Grant. So going back to your opening comments about, the Pacific and funding, no Australian funding body would fund any work in the Pacific, only in the Australian region. And the Australia Pacific Science Foundation excludes Palau and Micronesia from its scope. So
Why? Why?
Yeah, good question. I have no idea. I have asked them. I haven't got a great response. I think
who administers that body?
Good question. I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up.
Because this is the kind of stuff that I think we need to talk about. Whoever you are, and I have no idea. That's bullshit. Frankly, bullshit. Shame on you.
Yeah, it was a shame. I have a feeling it's because this region is often regarded as being under the American influence, and that they probably feel that, the Americans will support it. So that grant I mentioned does cover a lot of the South Pacific, but this region seems to have escaped a lot of that.
And that was pre-Trump, I'm guessing.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. because they have to have a different opinion now, because there's nobody in the Trump administration that's going to put money into anything in the Pacific other than Hawaii. I mean, or a new military base. That's the only thing they would consider.
That's right. So the good news, I'd definitely like to acknowledge that we received some funding from the Rufford small grants, which are great at funding things wide, based
I've
in
got that here.
Britain.
Rufford Small, based in Britain. Yeah.
Yep. And also we were
Club
very lucky.
300. What's Club 300?
Oh, yes. So Club 300, the Swedish Bird Protection Association. So as far as I understand, it's a group of Swedish bird watchers that fund, and those particularly that have seen the top number of birds in Sweden, which is 300, I think, which in the elite bird watching club, and they donate money to a cause each year. And we were very lucky that they decided that ours was a worthy cause. So they gave us a small amount of funding, and also the World Pheasant Association, which is an IUCN subgroup that focuses on the broader group of pheasants, which include quails and lots of things. And they were very happy to provide some funding for us as well. So without that, this project wouldn't have been possible. And even as it was a struggle. Given that just return flights from Australia are a minimum of $2,600, basically we were lucky to get 2 field seasons in, and including some generosity around reduced fees for boat hire and things like that. So it's not easy, but I don't want to make this about the logistics, but I guess even working in paradise certainly is not always particularly easy. And so we were very glad anyway to be able to undertake this project. So shall I lead you through the main component?
Just before you do, Rob, the people who live on Palau, what is their sort of cultural and ethnic base? What are the main influences on those people and the activities that they do?
No, great question, Grant. Palau's a really fascinating place. The Palauans, there's about 30,000 Palauans, and they are part of the Micronesian migration of peoples, which I believe, from my very poor understanding of anthropology, they think that a lot of the origin of that movement of people was from parts of Indonesia, and they moved across that northern Pacific region. So certainly culturally distinct to a lot of the Polynesian and South Pacific cultures, with a very different language as well. Palauan is a different language to even that of the rest of the Federated States of Micronesia, for example. And so a small country with very strong and proud traditions. Fairly close to the west of Palau is the Philippines. Having said that, I don't think there's been a very large cultural influence from the Philippines, but Micronesia is recognised as a culturally distinct region as opposed to Melanesia and as opposed to Polynesia. And so you'll definitely find quite a different culture there.
And you spent quite a bit of time there. So what's the main economic activity there? Is it fishing and forestry?
No, it's actually tourism. It's something like 70% of their GDP is now from tourism. And look, Palau's an outlier, a really positive one, in that, as we mentioned earlier, it became a republic removed from the Federated States of Micronesia. And they said, right, we are going to be the world's best destination for high-end ecotourism. And in fact, they are. You open any magazine, world #1 dive site, Palau, best snorkel site, Palau, best, wreck dives, Palau. It really is outstanding. And I believe divers, I've had people just look at me in awe when I said that I've been to Palau, that it's on their bucket list. So they've been very good at doing that. And another really positive thing I'm extremely impressed is Palau has a mandatory departure tax, which is a green tax, and it goes to funding their national environment program. Now, they've recently upped that, and they've recently decided to move away even more from mass market tourism. They were getting quite a lot of sort of, I guess you could say, working class tourism from all over the world, also a lot from Taiwan, China, Japan. They recently decided to rebrand to only top end as well, and said that because they were concerned about the destruction to key tourism sites from having so many tourists. So Palau's really going the right way. They had the world's first ever ocean sanctuary. They have the world's only shark sanctuary. They really are world leaders. They're very strong advocates for climate change. So an incredibly positive and inspiring place to be, which is nice, Grant, after talking about our negativity about world events. Palau's a good place to cleanse the soul, I think.
But this is what's so frustrating though, Rob. Palau, how many people did you say? 30,000 people?
30,000 residents, yeah.
30,000 residents. Oh, and here we have our government and other governments who, monstrous monstrous population sizes compared to Palau, and they're all going, climate change, it's all too hard. We can't protect anything. It's all too hard. For crying out loud.
Pacific nations are real leaders in climate change because they're seeing the effects firsthand, of course.
Absolutely. Now, Rob, I'll just throw in an aside because, of course, I can't help make it all about me. The main thing I was aware of with Palau is that heaps and heaps of Japanese and Korean pop groups go there to do their film clips on the beaches. So
yeah. It's a very popular destination. No wonder. It's quite an astounding place. And I think that's right. There's a very special relationship with Taiwan, which is somewhat aggravating to China at the moment as well, that Palau is one of those few nations that will acknowledge Taiwan and has preferential relationships with them. And Japan formerly was a very big contributor to tourism, but after some of the economic downturns there, it's been less so. So, yeah, as you say, a very, very popular destination for all sorts of things.
Well, there's so many reasons for us to be interested in and supportive of Palau. Good on them.
Definitely. I recommend. The only problem for Australia is it's so bloody hard to get there. But if you had a direct flight, it would be about 5 hours. But instead, your current 3 options are you have to fly to Seoul in South Korea and take a flight, you have to fly to Tokyo and take a flight, or the Philippines. And in fact, there is an option from Perth, I fly to Cairns, then to Guam in the Northern Marianas, and then overnight, and then I take a flight to Palau. So it's frustratingly difficult for an Australian to get to is the only problem.
But if you're an Australian who is a bird nerd, you would go to the Philippines and you would ignore what most of the Westerners in the Philippines go there for, and you would go and look for the Philippines cockatoo, or you would go and have a look for the bleeding heart pigeons, you would go and check out the Philippines eagle, and then you would pop over to Guam or over to Palau. And and you would check out the amazing bird life in the Pacific. So that should be like the 4-week odyssey that people do instead of heading off to see the boring brick buildings in Europe.
Couldn't agree more. That's my life philosophy, though. Yeah. So I'm probably not a good judge of normal people.
I mean, I'm someone who's been to the Philippines a number of times, and Indonesia, Malaysia, whatnot. I haven't done the Thailand thing much, but I can absolutely recommend go and check out the parts of the Philippines that people don't go to. Go bird watching. It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to find. It's pretty hard to find anyone in the Philippines who won't think you are crazy when you say, I came here to go bird watching, because I'm going to go, do people do that? You know? But yeah, look, there's ways to make these things happen, and look, good on Palau. If they only want rock stars and celebrities and whatnot to go there, they might have priced me out of their tourism. But look, if you've got the money, go there, support it. Now, Rob, I've interrupted you again. Let's get back onto megafowl. Megafowl, megafauna.
Giant chickens, really, at the end of the day. Yeah, sure. So I guess, we were lucky enough to work in the World Heritage listed Rock Island Southern Lagoon, which is the main famous bit of Palau that sits south of the capital island of Koror. And there's beautiful limestone islands spread out through the Pacific Ocean in that region. And on those islands, if you're lucky, you will go and have a picnic and arrive on a boat. And if you're sitting there a while, you might catch a glimpse of a Palau scrub fowl darting through the undergrowth. And probably more likely, if you go on a little wander, particularly close to the edge of the beach, you might see these really huge mounds. And we came across one mound that was about the same height as a person. So we're talking about 1.8 metres high. And that was the largest one they knew, and probably 4 metres across at least. So that was a very ancient one potentially. We don't really know. So pretty big structures that they build. So the main work that we did in collaboration with some of the great Palauan ornithologists on the island, there were a few parts. So I guess we'll start off with probably, I think, almost one of the most interesting stories that we've recently published a paper on. That was that a lot of these islands, as we mentioned, they're beautiful. They're very visited by tourists, and to the stage that it's ridiculous. One of the popular islands called Oolong Island. Now, if you think you don't know this island, you probably do, because if any of you out there are fans of Survivor, it's the infamous Rat Island from Survivor Palau. And indeed, it is the worst rat-infested place I've ever been. So a few minutes of sitting on the island, rat will literally come up to you asking for food. And I saw Palauans kill rats by throwing coconuts at them. Their rats are that complacent. So, it doesn't bode well, but strangely enough, it's still a reasonably good bird watching spot. And so tourists are arriving constantly to have their picnics at this beach. So the first part of the study that we did that I think was really interesting is we looked at 5 islands that are heavily visited by tourists. And what happens, most of these tourist boats, there's a flotilla of them depart their capital each day going out to all these islands. And they like to stop for morning tea or lunch or afternoon tea at these little picnic islands, we call them. They're just nice atoll islands where there's a little bit of infrastructure like a picnic table. But they're really heavily visited. It could be hundreds of tourists a day stop in. And we had this idea, well, that can't be good for the scrub fowl on these islands. And what's that doing to rats? So in this recent study, which was the first of Paul's thesis, we actually compared 5 islands that were tourist visited with 5 that were not. And we did 2 things. We did surveys of the scrub fowl, where basically we did timed point counts and we looked at how often we encountered the scrub fowl. And then we also did a really cool thing. We used what are called chew tags, which are basically a wax tag impregnated with a really tasty scent, which was mostly peanut butter. And we could tie them to stakes and leave them out just for a couple of days and come back. And we could look at all the bite marks on them. And there's a way of working out how that translates to a relative abundance of rats, i.e., do you have stacks or do you not have very many? And we could convert that into a percentage. So the long story short of all of that was a really interesting finding that we had from that study, which was that we found that on islands that were heavily visited by tourists, there was actually a lot less likely to encounter those scrub fowl. Their activity was less, so they were potentially being put off somewhat by people. So tourist-free islands, there was a 93% chance of coming across scrub fowl, and that dropped to only 47% on islands where tourists were present. So definitely a bit of a disturbance issue. And likewise with rats, really interesting result. We found that the detection probability of rats on islands that were tourist visited was up to 99%. So you're guaranteed to have a rat on those islands. And islands that didn't have tourists, it varied between 50 to 73%. So it could be really half the number of rats. So unfortunately, rats are probably everywhere on those islands. So we suspect that tourism is subsidising rat numbers. And by that we mean there's a great free food source of, people eat a sandwich, I've had enough, crumbs drop. They were generally doing a good job of taking litter away, but I suspect not always. People come and camp as well privately on the island. So we suspect that rat numbers just boomed in relation to that. We have a hypothesis that we couldn't prove in this study, which was that rats may be predating either the eggs or the hatched chicks of the scrub fowl as well. But we tried and we couldn't actually find eggs or chicks in our study anyway, which might be a whole other story, but I don't have any science to talk about with that. So that was a really interesting finding. So maybe, I'm not saying tourism is bad, and remembering this is their prime GDP, we've got an interesting but maybe a positive avenue for some good management practices here.
To your knowledge, Rob, is anyone doing particular ornithological tours, bird tours to Palau?
They are. So generally these are done by big international bird watching companies, and usually there's a couple a year like Bird Quest that will include generally the whole region. They'll go to Palau and then they'll go to the Federated States of Micronesia. And when in Palau, they usually do use one of the local ornithologists we work with, Milang Ebadong. So they do get the locals there. But a lot of it's probably, it's seen as a relatively safe and easy destination. So a lot of it's probably people just doing their own thing.
So apart from tourism and 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 rats, and climate change as we covered earlier, what are the other significant threats for the species and probably all the island dependent birds?
Yeah, look, I mean, one interesting one that's not to be downplayed is for some of them, probably egg collecting is the number one issue for some species. Now, Palau, we'd like to do a bit more on this. It's obviously a bit of a political and sensitive topic. We have been told that it was a very significant thing culturally, and that generally elders have been telling people that it not to and that it's less favoured, but we were also told that it does still happen. And why not? I guess you're going to a nice picnic island and you're a local and, dig up a mound, grab a few eggs, boil them up. We don't really know the impact that that's having on this species. But again, some other scrub fowl, particularly some in Indonesia that I have another student working on, like the Moluccan scrub fowl, there are formal egg harvesting in place by multiple villages, which vary in their degree of cultural regulation, but we're trying to work on that. So look, for some of them, I suspect that's a really big impact, because you can imagine if you don't understand how many eggs are going into a population and you're taking 90% of them every year, you're already off to a bad start without all these other factors that are affecting populations.
That sounds like there's no shortage of projects that could be undertaken to assist in gathering the knowledge that's needed. Can I ask you, Rob, what do you think the chances are that not just the Palau subspecies? Actually, let's sort that out. Are we talking a species or a subspecies?
Right. Well, I think if we revisit this in a couple of years, you'll definitely be looking at a full species. So currently it is lumped as a species. It's Megapodius laperus, and the Palau subspecies is Senex. But you have to go probably almost 2,000 kilometres to the east, to the Northern Marianas Islands, to find its current cousin, which is a different subspecies over there. However, that species not only has a different call, it lives in different habitat, and it doesn't nest in the same way using vegetation decomposition. So all the leading experts like Doug Pratt, who's worked in the region, are very convinced it's just a matter of time to formalise this split. And even so, I think everyone's agreed that they're so geographically separated that you could not sort of advocate the loss of the Palau population, for example, knowing that it might be a unique species.
I'm guessing nobody's had any funding to do any real genetic analysis.
No, that's right. And the group as a whole is in dire need of it. That's something we had hoped to do, but again, a lot of challenges precluded us from doing that in this study. So it's on the long-term future list.
What's the red list status of the Palau subspecies?
So it's currently endangered, and I think it's probably going to stay that way given it's got a relatively small range. And the problem with it is that if you look at Palau, there are a lot of islands, and there's one of the biggest islands in the entire Pacific is in Palau. It's Babeldob, which is a large granite-based high island, unlike the rest of the archipelago, which is limestone. However, as far as we know, there's one or two scattered records of scrub fowl there. They're not really on the biggest island. So what that leaves is a bunch of these gorgeous looking islands, but they're mostly high limestone islands with a very narrow fringe of beach and strand vegetation, as we call it. And yet that's the only place that the scrub fowl like to nest. So you're talking a few percent of the area of an already small island that's actually suitable for the scrub fowl. So all of those combine to a very small area of occupancy within their range. There is one slight exception. There's an atoll that we visited to the north of Palau called Kyangle, and that seems to be perhaps scrub fowl central. There's estimated there could be 500 birds on that island. But overall, I'd say, those are very low-lying islands as well, that they got absolutely destroyed in one of the big recent hurricanes a few years ago. It completely wiped the island of Kyangle off the map. As far as we know, the birds have survived, but it just shows how perilous an existence is in the Pacific.
And the catastrophic individual incident combined with all of the other pressures make existence really tenuous in any of those islands and these, it's not a scientific term. That's why I have real scientists come in and talk to me. But they're like these, individual micro habitats for want of a correct scientific term. You get a fire, you get a flood, you get a hurricane, a typhoon, and they're done.
Exactly. And there's the most exciting paper we're still working on publishing, where this student, Paul Radley, who's now living and working in Hawaii, he mapped all the mounds in the rock islands that we could find, and then he simulated different climate change scenarios and the amount of sea level rise that would result in. So for some of those small islands, it's pretty scary. We're talking at least half or more of the island being submerged under even conservative climate change scenarios. So we're sort of thinking that there's going to be this concept of these key refuge islands that won't be underwater, and we need to try really hard to mitigate sea level rise, maybe with physical barriers, and the megapodes or scrubfowl might survive on those islands, but we're definitely going to lose them, or lose their habitat at least, on some of those other islands.
And that's a example of how technology and the great work in computing has combined now to be affordable enough for these kind of projects to go ahead, and with the rapid implementation and development of drones, probably give a whole new suite of management techniques to these small nations that will be available to them.
Definitely. And I mean, again, everything with the Pacific points to logistical challenge, and that specific study was in fact our hardest, because the best data set we could find was not the one available publicly. We worked with a private company in California that have been trying to improve the digital mapping for that region, but even that is not really accurate enough for us to do the sort of modelling we needed. So we keep finding, as anyone works in the Pacific knows, the data is just not there. I mean, you're talking very coarse, very low resolution, because it's on no one's priority list to go and do, what we call LiDAR, so using, this really sophisticated mapping and 3D characterization, which we have for most of the world. It just doesn't exist. There's not even great topographical maps for a lot of this region. So it makes it very hard to do this sort of work.
I think the key term you used there, Rob, was publicly available. I'm guessing that there might be a general in China or in the US that has much better data available to them.
Well, it's interesting. So technically Palau should have been quite good, because there is an active US base there. And we did actually have a military contact, and we did ask, and they at least claimed that there weren't any better data sets. But as you say, whether that was for strategic reasons, we don't know.
Yeah, it'd be like, while he's shaking his head, he's thinking, how can we hide this? How can we hide this? No, but that's just the cynic in me again. But I think both of those nations know a lot more about the environment and the landforms and the depths of the oceans than they're telling anybody else in the Pacific at the moment. The full computation.
I think I'd like to add too that, what you were sort of saying about the lack of funding and focus in this area. In the big global review we did of all the scrubfowl, all the megapodes, the number one most threatened species we've listed, which is something called the Wageo or Brugens brush turkey, is because we don't know anything about it. It's super rare, it's super restricted, there wasn't even enough research to do basic data summaries for most of our stuff. So we've highlighted that species in flashing lights going, well, this could be extinct, but we don't even have the basic data to do anything. So, I think this is one of probably my biggest message almost of the day. My biggest hobby horse is, the Pacific's a great example of this. People like to sit out there and think, scientists have all the answers, we know all this. We can't even get funding to study the basic ecology of a threatened species. And there's funds like the Bin Zayed Foundation, based out of the United Arab Emirates. It's the world's biggest contributor to threatened species funding. I've tried for years and never been able to leverage it. And the unfortunate message is, look, we're really sorry, but there is just so many people working on stuff that's ready to fall off the precipice that we're prioritising. And basically people, quite rightly, that are working on something where there's 5 individuals left get the funding because there's no other mechanism for funding this sort of work. So even an endangered bird in the Pacific doesn't make the shortlist. So, the same applies in Australia. We're talking about an exotic overseas place, but you could pick, a bunch of species in Australia and probably guarantee no one's done any work on them. So almost getting back to basics, basic natural history. And the problem is that it's not sexy academically. It doesn't get you the sort of KPIs in my job of doing, high impact papers, but it's essential to conservation. Ideally, government should be doing these things. In the case of the Pacific, they don't have the funding. In the case of Australia, they don't have the funding, and the politics has cut their ability to do it. So this is a really big problem.
Rob, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I think we're at the point now where for so many years, you look at the success of the great sort of legendary conservation projects like the California condor, the peregrine falcon. I'm old enough to remember when all of the publicity in the sort of nature and wildlife magazines and whatnot was the threat of losing the peregrine falcon. Now, and they're all funded by the big bodies, universities, governments, everyone got behind it. But as you said, the competition for money is so intense for these established benefactors and donors that if people care, if they really do care, and it's a personal choice to care, we have to take action ourselves. That's why I'm making this podcast. And I think if you are someone who is listening and you think you care, well, bloody well prove it that you care. Select a bird. I don't care if it's the orange-bellied parrot. I don't care if it's a swift parrot. I don't care if it's a Palau Megapode. What was the groovy one? We don't even know if it still exists.
Oh yeah, the Wageo brush turkey.
And where is that possibly still hanging on?
In West Papua, in the sort of the Indonesian islands to the west of mainland PNG.
Okay, well, going back to what I was saying, stop giving money to the poor dogs in Bali, because the poor bloody dogs in Bali shouldn't be there. Make a really sensible, in my opinion, contribution to something that can't get money from the bodies that you think should be giving money to them. It's not going to come from our governments anymore. It's not going to come from the universities. We're murdering the universities in Western countries.
Yeah.
It's just, the sheiks in the Saudi countries, the Middle East, the oil riches, they're going to be given to Muslim countries like Bangladesh, and so they should be. There's going to be priorities. Don't buy another bloody TV, right? Don't upgrade your spa with the money that the government's throwing around with housekeeper or whatever bloody ridiculous name they've come up with now. Give it to the Swift Parrot Project. Give it to the study of grass wrens. Give it to the study of megapodes. Look up Rob. Find out where you can make a difference and make a bloody difference. Buy a lapel badge. Do something. Do something, for crying out loud.
Yeah, no, great. I definitely agree with that sentiment, and seen firsthand it's one of my big frustrations. And, you know, combined with the fact that university researchers are often, in essence, propping up failed government conservation departments, in that we don't have to be working on this stuff. It's not part of our system. But, you know, for me, it's a personal choice. I couldn't see anything else that was more important. And if I don't, no one will. But, you know, in an ideal world, yeah, it's something a government department should be doing. It's their birds, it's their species. They need to manage it on behalf of people. But unfortunately, with the cuts that we've had, it's just not possible anymore.
Yeah. And look, I'm probably people will switch off with too much politics and whatnot, Rob. But I think we're just at the point where, look, don't write another bloody letter or sign another bloody petition, because haven't we learned in the last 15 years or so that they're not working? Unless you can get Greta Thunberg or David Attenborough to make a fuss, nobody is listening. So, again, do something. Do not vote for the people who do not do anything. Make a statement, you know. Only take, if 5% of people in this country, probably the same in the US and the UK, if they actually voted for the environment, 5% more of the 42 to 44% who were rusted on to the failed politicians, you only need 5% of those people to make a decision and do something. And things will change. Just, you know, don't buy another TV, you know. Don't replace your sofa. Just do something else, please.
Yep, I think if people donate to organisations like BirdLife Australia, BirdLife International, and I mean locally, you've got amazing work being done by Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Bush Heritage, and I think as a biologist that they're the only areas I see hope, that we have these amazing NGOs that have stepped up and are basically conserving biodiversity for everyone in a private capacity. So definitely, I would strongly echo that sentiment. If everyone once a year could donate something to those organisations, it really is helping to save biodiversity.
Yes, and for those listening, sorry that I occasionally put down my affable personality and pick up my snarky one, but, you know, time's running out, you know. Time's running out. And just slightly off topic, but we all used to be so worried about nuclear annihilation that most of the resources of the planet have been put into building ships, planes, guns and bombs. And we're facing annihilation and having bloody meetings about it. Bloody hell, you know, I can't swear I've got to edit out my swearing, otherwise the podcast can't get heard in India, you know. But everywhere, wherever you are, just make one choice to do one thing. What's a bloody $2,000 leather sofa? That's how much they cost that are being advertised on the TV. Just, if you're renovating, don't buy the sofa, but send the money somewhere that will make a difference. All right, I'm done with that now, Rob. I'm done with that. But I want to pick up the thread. Now, before I do pick up the thread and we move to something a bit more lighthearted, what do you think is the biggest threat to the megapodes in the Pacific, and what do you think is the most critical action, the number one action that needs to happen?
Really great question. I'm probably going to be really unsatisfying and typical scientist and give you more than one answer.
That's fine, because that's fine.
For different species, there's a different answer. So, for instance, the Tongan megapode is probably one that suffered a lot from habitat loss and from egg harvesting, whereas, in Palau, they're probably not big issues. We're probably talking about human disturbance from tourism and climate change, particularly sea level rise. Palau's, again, this unique bubble in that you've got a place that has hardly been touched in terms of clearing, which is just amazing. It's really quite a pristine island to date. I think there's something like 80% of it still vegetated with primary vegetation, so almost unheard of. But that is not the case for a lot of the Pacific. And as a group, actually, there's something I should have mentioned, that there's been some really great paleontological research. There's a famous figure in the Pacific bird world called David Steadman, and he's spent a lifetime going across the Pacific and excavating subfossil remains. And unfortunately, most of the Pacific diversity is now extinct. But he's worked out there were probably at least double the number of megapodes that we have today, and almost every major Pacific island had an endemic species, like Samoa, like Fiji, and they're all gone now, but we know from some really good bones that have been found that they existed. So, they're very vulnerable, and in fact, there's only really one megapode left in the true South Pacific now, which is on Tonga, and that's very imperiled as well. So I think certainly, invasive species are often put up. I mean, rats for some, but I personally think cats. Most of these islands, people have cats. Any major Pacific island with a lot of people living on it, of course, there's feral cat problems. For a ground-dwelling, ground-nesting bird, I suspect that's a fairly fatal combination. And then, of course, huge development pressures on these small islands. A spreading population that's growing is destroying primary habitat. So that, and then for some species that are really connected to beaches, you have this problem with what we call like a colonial nesting species. So like the Moluccan scrub fowl, where they use geothermal sands or just solar radiation on the beach, but they all converge to literally say the whole population might use 3 breeding beaches. And you can only imagine there's a tourism development proposal for a resort or something like that happens, you've lost the species potentially. They can't adapt in that time. So there's some really big impacts. And I mean, major tourism developments through the Pacific have certainly resulted in large-scale changes to beaches and habitat on fairly small islands, and then bringing with them the usual swag of invasive species. So look, they're all different problems. So what can people do was your question. I mean, I think some of these answers are easy. So there's been a great example in Palau on only one of the many islands the megapode occupies. The NGO Island Conservation has eradicated rats from the island completely and successfully. So that island is now free of rats for that species. So certainly that no doubt will help a lot, and cats would be great. And then I really genuinely believe for some of them we need to think a bit differently, and engineering solutions are probably the only hope for mitigating things like those tidal surges associated with those hurricane events. We can't, yes, we all need to address climate change, but realistically, is it going to stop this happening in the short term? No, it's not. So by the time that we do anything, if we do, it will be too late. So I think identifying those core islands, putting up sea walls perhaps, or some sort of barriers, might be really essential in giving a helping hand to these species adapting.
All right, I'm going to say to people, without ranting, don't buy a sofa, don't go to Harvey Norman, go to Palau on your holiday and gleefully, gladly, happily pay the departure tax.
Yep.
So that something in terms of mitigation, green projects can happen in at least one location. Do something.
That's right. Donate to the Palau Conservation Society. You can Google them. They have a website. You can donate online, become a member, and go there and ask for a local ornithologist to show you around. Use local businesses, because all of that says, hey, this is a thing that makes us money and it's really important and we need to protect it.
Well, I can confidently predict that Rob's going to give me all of the links that he think worthy of support. Yep. And then he won't make a liar out of me. I can say, in the links, down below in the show notes. Make a choice and do it.
That's right.
All right, Rob. We want to lighten the mood a little bit because that's what we normally do. This is probably the heaviest stuff that we've talked about, and we've been having fun at the same time. Let's talk about Rob Davis, the man. Rob, well, I have to have the bit at the end. When it goes without saying that you're a confirmed bird nerd. Now, anyone who's been listening can't doubt that. When did you realise that you were really into birds? When were you aware that you were not like other people?
Well, that answer is probably different. That one might have been early on in life. Well, look, I think there's two memories I have of that. I mean, one has been quite young. Actually, before Fiji, I lived in Botswana in Africa, and I still remember to this day, I could have only been about maybe 4 or 5. I remember looking out the front window and gasping in awe as I saw this bird fly past. And I now know from looking at my bird books that it was one of the glossy starlings, one of the African glossy starlings. And it was just this vivid flash of iridescence and this sheen that still sticks with me to this day. That's my first memory of a bird, and it was obviously a fairly spectacular one. But actually, I had a late run in life in that I went to the biology thing quite early on and had a big interest in the marine environment from being in Fiji and the animals of Africa, and did my biology degree. And I actually did my honours studies and PhD on frogs. But it was during my first environmental consultancy trip in second year uni, someone said to me, "Do you know your birds?" And I said, "No, not really." I said, "Well, take these binoculars and here's a field guide. Go off for 20 minutes and tell me what you've seen." And I said, "If you want to do this sort of thing for a job, you're going to need to know birds." And I did. And even that 20 minutes really suddenly opened up my world. And for the first time was looking at this hitherto unknown diversity and trying to match it to a book. And then I was lucky enough to be guided by a really amazing person who started pointing out all the calls and said, "Hear that sound, that's this bird." And I suddenly, thought, wow, that's really incredible. And it really was this feeling of this entire diversity that I felt most people in society were oblivious to, that your life, as all birders know, is never the same again. I mean, I literally remember standing there at my own wedding ceremony making a note of what birds I could hear calling. Like it's like that, till your dying moment, you will be aware of the birds going, "Oh, that's a spotted pardalote. That's interesting. Oh, there's some purple crown lorikeets." So, it really is that level that you realise most people don't have. And suddenly, you're not alone because you can identify all these species around you all the time. So it really was that sort of epiphany moment that went from, you need to know this for a job to really reconnecting with birds. And that's not changed since.
You're at the extreme end of the spectrum, Rob.
Yeah, perhaps.
I love that. Now, that leads me into one of my standard questions, Rob. What's your field guide of choice? And again, you don't have to talk about an Australian one.
Gosh, that is a tricky one. Wow. A bit stumped by that. I'm not sure I have one. Yeah,
all right. Let me make the question easier to answer. What's the one that you currently use most often?
Probably none. That's going to sound bad, and it's going to make me sound rather antagonistic with your question. But I guess that for Australian birds where I live, I don't usually need a field guide anymore. So it's only really on overseas travels. So I suppose depending on the country of choice, I use a different one. But increasingly, we're getting amazing apps. And even with the apps, somewhat controversially as a West Australian, I probably use quite a hybrid of Michael Morecambe's field guide, which is a lot more West Australian focused, including the calls, but definitely a big fan of Pizzy and Knight and the amazing pictures in that. But yeah, I think that, I mean, I can hijack your question a bit by saying that the rise of apps has been quite incredible. And I suppose that might be why I'm less wedded to something. So trips I've done, I've suddenly found, oh, there's a new, like the Birds of New Zealand, there's an app that I could get, and I had the calls there, and it really revolutionises things. From, I remember my early trips taking a stack of books, particularly somewhere like South America, and it was significant amount of kilos of your checked luggage, and you can now have all of that on your iPhone. Is absolutely incredible, and with the calls as well. So that's really revolutionised it. I will say, with the Pacific, probably the best recent guide I've seen by far is Guy Dutson's guide to the birds of Melanesia. But the rest of the Pacific, and that doesn't include Palau, for example, they're generally quite poor. There's been some like the Van Perlo guide, which is rather generic, but I think it hasn't yet received the amazing treatment that it should. I'd like something like the New Birds of New Guinea guide that included the South Pacific. And I know Doug Pratt is working on a revised version of a field guide, but it's been many years in the making, and I'm not sure when that will come to fruition. Might be in my bucket list project.
I appreciate the answer, Rob, because coincidentally, I had a dream last night. I don't usually remember any of my dreams, but I woke up very early this morning thinking, I have to modify my questions. I have to ask about apps.
Yeah, there you go.
So it's been on my mind. So thank you for that, and I think that will come into the standard end of episode questions. Because the ones that you've been talking about, and that a few people have mentioned in my recent interviews, that some of them have not seen the light of day yet, have mentioned apps that I wasn't aware of. So I think we need to publicise them a bit more, because it can be pretty hard to find apps, even if you know they're out there. If you don't know the exact name or maybe the publisher, you might not find them in the app stores because they're so crowded. So we'll work on that. Rob, where's your favourite place to go bird watching?
Well, let's see. That is a good question. I think probably couldn't top so far Papua New Guinea, just for the exoticness of the birds, if I can use that word. And I suppose, as one of my friends once put it, and this is a very barbed comment aimed to antagonise, are you a real birder if you haven't seen a bird of paradise? So I'll just leave that to resonate and antagonise the birding community. But it is quite true. I think, it was a bit of life-changing. I was lucky enough to see king bird of paradise and Ragiana bird of paradise, and it's probably the ultimate. So I love tropical birding in Southeast Asia, and of course, hands down, South America is just overwhelming for diversity. But probably the most satisfying birding in being able to see birds really well and photograph them was definitely South Africa for me. So I think Africa was very different. A lot of the tropics, as you probably well know, it's very hard to get good looks at birds, and they're way up in a canopy, whereas I really enjoyed the sort of safari-style birding of Southern Africa, that you got amazing looks, could get photographs of things, and you didn't have the furtive glimpses that you do in the tropics.
Yes, and people, if you go to Africa, you don't have to shoot animals to have a good time.
Oh, that's right. Only on your camera.
Correct. Rob, I'm guessing you're a bit of a collector of good gadgets to assist in your work. So what is the favourite piece of equipment that you take with you when you're out in the field?
They're probably pretty basic, to be honest. They're not too high tech. I mean, well, one surprising thing you might not have thought applies to bird watching, but it's revolutionised all of ecology, which is just camera traps, the remote cameras. Now, these proved incredibly useful for trying to understand the secret life of the Palau scrub fowl, and we're currently aiming to use on a project on the critically endangered Abrolhos painted button quail over here in Western Australia. So, camera traps can be really quite amazing for trying to reveal these sorts of things. And then a good old-fashioned handheld microphone boom, and my Rance recorder that I still have, an old one, is great for recording bird calls when we're out and about, and of course the trusty Swarovski binoculars. So I travel pretty light and simple, really.
Well, I'm glad you got a binocular plug in there, because I'm looking for a way to monetize the podcast, and of course the only people who are likely to spend money on a bird podcast is a binocular or camera company. So thank you very much for that one.
May I suggest that be a question for future people, because there's that's the great politics of bird watching, isn't it? Oh, you're like a fellow user, or some like size.
Well, nobody's taken the bait yet, but I have had one person tell me that their favourite piece of equipment is their binoculars, and I don't care what people say, because like it could be a pencil, because if you're maintaining a list, pencils are better to take out in the bush than a ballpoint pen. So
exactly.
If you didn't take an iPad or a phone with you, and you're not ticking off your list on your app.
No.
Rob, this is probably going to be the hardest one, but it's the stock standard question. What is your favourite bird?
That is always the hard one, isn't it? Gosh, no. I'm going to highball it to the kingbird of paradise. I think that's the most amazing bird I've ever seen, that I was most happy to see because I never thought I would. So I'm going to go with that.
I think that's fair enough. I'll try and find a link to that famous David Attenborough footage, because that puts on a pretty mega show in that. And of course, you instantly recognise what I was talking about.
Yep.
It's iconic bird footage, a bit like the kakapo in Last Chance to See. There's a couple of things that you never unsee. Once you've seen them, you can never unsee. Rob, I think we've successfully got to the end. I haven't launched into another rant. People are probably very thankful for that. I'm already going to invite you on to do another episode shortly, Rob, because there's so many things that need to be talked about. You're in Western Australia, and we haven't even talked about in detail any of the amazing species there that are under pressure. And there's a whole heap of different birds in the Pacific that need some attention. So if you would like to, Rob, you are a welcome guest anytime.
Thank you, Grant. Very much appreciated and deeply honoured.
Well, I hope people have had a bit of an awakening about the species that really need a hand. And Rob, please do send me some links for any of the causes that you think need support in the Pacific, and also any of the people that you were referencing who need the awareness needs to be raised about the work that they're doing, because that's what this is all about. That's why I'm doing it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Grant. Will do.
Signing off. No, just know that you can assist me to do what I'm doing, so that I can help assist Rob do what he's doing. Subscribe to the podcast anywhere that you are listening to it. Apple, Google, Podchaser, anything, Stitcher. It's everywhere. Just subscribe and share, and leave a review. And actually, I've had some very nice private messages, Rob, from people telling me how much they like the podcast. While I appreciate those private messages, I really am sucking up to everyone for some social proof at the moment. So get on to Apple or wherever. You can leave reviews again, Stitcher. You can send them to me a private message on Twitter, but tell me that I can use it, and I'll go and use it. It's all about the more people who listen, the more birds people are going to know about, and the more actions that people are going to take. So
Exactly right.
thanks for listening. That's it for this go.